The morning fog rolled across San Francisco Bay like a gray blanket, obscuring the city skyline that Jonathan Blake had once conquered with his vision and determination. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Marin County mansion, the 50-year-old tech mogul watched the world disappear into mist. Much like his own future had vanished 3 hours earlier in Dr. Harrison's sterile office. 3 months, maybe 6, if you respond well to treatment. The words echoed in his mind like a death sentence delivered in the calm, professional tone that doctors used when they had practiced delivering bad news too many times. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, metastasized. The disease that had claimed Steve Jobs, and now it wanted Jonathan Blake. He had built Blake Industries from nothing, transforming a small software company into a global empire worth $40 billion. His innovations in artificial intelligence and quantum computing had revolutionized 3 different industries. Presidents called him for advice, universities offered him honorary degrees, and magazines featured him on covers as one of the most influential people of the century. Yet none of that mattered now. Death, it seemed, was the ultimate equalizer. The mansion around him felt more like a mausoleum than a home. 32 rooms spread across 15 acres of manicured grounds, filled with priceless art, rare books, and technology that most people could only dream of. But for all its grandeur, the house echoed with emptiness. Jonathan had never married, had no children, and his relationships had always been secondary to his work. Success, he had learned too late, was a poor substitute for companionship. His phone buzzed incessantly on the marble kitchen counter, displaying missed calls from his sister Rebecca, his business partners, and reporters who had somehow caught wind of his medical appointments. He ignored them all. What could he possibly say? That the great Jonathan Blake, master of the digital universe, was as vulnerable as any ordinary mortal. The sound of a car pulling up the circular driveway broke through his dark thoughts. Through the window, he watched as Rosa Martinez, his head housekeeper of 15 years, stepped out of her Toyota Camry. With her came a young woman he had never seen before. The newcomer was petite, perhaps 24 or 25, with long dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and warm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with quiet curiosity. She wore a modest blue dress and carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength, despite her obviously humble circumstances. There was something about her presence that made Jonathan pause in his brooding. Rosa knocked on the side entrance that led to the kitchen, as she had done countless times before. But when Jonathan opened the door, his attention was immediately drawn to the young woman standing slightly behind his longtime employee. "Mr. Blake," Rosa said in her familiar, motherly tone, "I hope you don't mind." "Rodriguez, with me today. She just moved here from Brownsville, Texas, and she's looking for work. I thought perhaps you might need some additional help around the house." Camila stepped forward with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from facing hardship with grace. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," she said, her voice soft but clear with just a trace of a Texas accent. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to meet you. Rosa has told me wonderful things about working here." Jonathan found himself studying her face, noting the way she met his eyes without flinching, despite the obvious difference in their social positions. In his world of corporate executives and socialites, most people either cowered before his wealth and power or tried to use it for their own advantage. Camila did neither. She simply stood there, genuine and unpretentious. "What kind of work experience do you have?" he asked, more out of politeness than real interest. His mind was still reeling. From the morning's medical consultation, and hiring household staff seemed trivial compared to contemplating his own mortality. "I helped run my family's small hotel back in Texas," Camila replied. "I did everything from managing the front desk to housekeeping to cooking for guests when our chef was unavailable. I also took care of my grandmother who had Alzheimer's disease for the last 3 years before she passed." Her voice carried a note of sadness when she mentioned her grandmother, but also a strength that suggested she had faced loss and emerged with her compassion intact. Something in her tone made Jonathan look at her more closely. He recognized the weight of caregiving in her words, the kind of emotional burden that came from watching someone you love slowly fade away. It was a pain he had never experienced himself, But now, facing his own decline, he felt a strange kinship with this young woman who understood the fragility of life. "Rosa, could you give us a moment?" Jonathan asked. His longtime housekeeper nodded and retreated to the kitchen, leaving him alone with Camila on the covered terrace that overlooked the bay. "Why do you want to work here?" Jonathan asked genuinely. "Curious. You're young, obviously intelligent. Surely there are better opportunities for someone like you than cleaning houses for rich people." Camila smiled, and Jonathan was surprised by how the expression transformed her entire face, making her eyes sparkle with warmth. "With respect, Mr. Blake, there's nothing wrong with honest work, no matter what form it takes. Told me that dignity comes from how you treat others and how well you do your job, not from what that job happens to be." Her answer struck him like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had spoken to him about dignity and honest work without wanting something in return? In his world, every conversation was a transaction. Every relationship had an ulterior motive, but Camila seemed completely genuine, untouched by the cynicism that had become his constant companion. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," he said quietly. "She was," Camila replied, and for a moment her composure cracked slightly, revealing the depth of her loss. "She raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 12. She taught me that every person deserves to be treated with kindness, regardless of their circumstances. She would have liked you, I think." "What makes you say that?" Jonathan was genuinely puzzled. Most people liked him for his money, his influence, or what he could do for them. But Camila had known him for all of 5 minutes. "Rosa told me about your scholarship program for underprivileged students. She said you've paid for over 1,000 young people to go to college, and you never ask for recognition or gratitude. That tells me you understand that true generosity comes from the heart, not from a desire for publicity." Jonathan felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. When was the last time someone had seen past his wealth to recognize something worthwhile in his character? He had established those scholarships almost as an afterthought, a tax write-off that happened to help people. He had never thought of it as generosity. "I could use some help around here," he heard himself saying, though he hadn't consciously decided to hire her. "Rosa can show you the routine. The pay is $1,500 a week, plus room and board if you want to stay on the property. There's a guest house by the pool that's not being used." Camila's eyes widened slightly at the generous offer, but she didn't immediately accept. "May I ask you something, Mr. Blake?" "Of course, are you all right? You seem—" She paused, searching for the right words, like someone who's carrying a heavy burden. The perceptiveness of her observation caught him completely off guard. He prided himself on his poker face, his ability to project strength and control even in the most challenging situations. Yet this young woman, who had known him for less than an hour, had seen through all his defenses to the fear and loneliness beneath. "I received some difficult news today," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "Nothing that concerns you, of course. Just business complications." Camila studied his face with those warm brown eyes, and Jonathan had the unsettling feeling that she could see right through his lie. But instead of pressing him, she simply nodded with understanding. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight alone," she said softly. "But they don't always have to be fought that way." Her words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that Jonathan wasn't ready to unpack. He turned away from her penetrating gaze, looking out over the bay, where the fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing patches of brilliant blue sky. "When can you start?" he asked, changing the subject back to safer ground. "Today, if you'd like," Camila replied. "I don't have much to move, just a suitcase and some books." Books. Jonathan found himself genuinely curious about what this young woman chose to read. Poetry, mostly. Pablo Neruda, Maya Angelou, Robert Frost. My grandmother loved poetry. She said it was how the heart spoke when regular words weren't enough. Camila blushed slightly, as if embarrassed by her admission. "I know it's not very practical, but they bring me comfort." Jonathan felt another unexpected stirring in his chest. His own library was filled with business journals, technical manuals, and biographies of other successful entrepreneurs. When was the last time he had read something simply because it brought him comfort? When was the last time he had done anything for the pure joy of it, There's a library on the second floor, he found himself saying. Feel free to use it whenever you like. And Camilla? She looked up at him expectantly. Manner. As she smiled and thanked him, Jonathan realized that something fundamental had shifted in the last hour. The mansion still felt too large and too empty, the fog still obscured the horizon, and he was still dying of cancer. But for the first time since receiving his diagnosis, he wasn't entirely alone with his fear. That afternoon, as he watched Camilla move through his house with quiet efficiency, he noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The way she arranged flowers in vases with an artist's eye for balance and beauty. How she hummed softly while she worked, filling the silent rooms with something that almost resembled life. The gentle way she spoke to Rosa, treating the older woman with the same respect she had shown him. By evening, the guest house had been prepared, and Camilla had settled in with her single suitcase and small collection of poetry books. Jonathan found himself standing at his bedroom window, watching the lights come on in her new quarters, wondering what it would be like to have someone nearby who might actually care if he lived or died. For 30 years, he had convinced himself that solitude was strength, that needing others was weakness. But as he faced the greatest challenge of his life, Jonathan Blake began to suspect that he had been wrong about many things. Perhaps if he was very lucky, he might have just enough time left to figure out what truly mattered. The fog rolled back in from the bay as darkness fell, but inside Blake Manor something had changed. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel quite so empty. And in his heart, Jonathan felt the first stirring of something he had almost forgotten existed. Hope. The following weeks passed in a rhythm that Jonathan had never experienced before. Each morning, he would find Camilla already at work, moving through the mansion with a grace that transformed mundane tasks into something almost meditative. She had an intuitive understanding of his needs without being intrusive, appearing with coffee precisely when he needed it most, ensuring his meals were prepared exactly how he preferred them, though he had never told her his preferences. More surprising was how she had begun to breathe life back into the sterile perfection of his home. Fresh flowers appeared in rooms that had been barren for years. Windows that had remained closed were opened to let in fresh air and natural light. The mansion still felt enormous, but it no longer felt quite so much like a tomb. Jonathan found himself looking forward to their brief conversations throughout the day. Camilla had a way of asking questions that made him think about things he had long taken for granted. She would inquire about the stories behind various pieces of art genuinely, curious about why he had chosen them. She asked about his work not from a business perspective, but because she wanted to understand what drove him to create and innovate. Most remarkably, she seemed completely unimpressed by his wealth. When he mentioned owning 3 other properties around the world, she simply nodded politely and asked if he actually enjoyed visiting them. When he showed her his collection of vintage cars, she admired their beauty, but wondered aloud whether he ever drove them just for the pleasure of driving, or if they were merely investments. Her questions forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his life. He realized that he had accumulated possessions not because they brought him joy, but because they were symbols of his success. He had stopped doing things for pleasure years ago, viewing every activity through the lens of productivity and profit. Dr. Harrison's weekly appointments had become increasingly grim. The cancer was progressing faster than expected, and the experimental treatments were causing debilitating side effects. Jonathan's appetite disappeared, his energy levels plummeted, and some mornings he could barely manage to get out of bed. Yet he had told no one about his condition, maintaining the fiction that his frequent absences were due to business meetings. Camilla, however, was beginning to notice. She started preparing smaller, more frequent meals when she realized he was struggling to eat large portions. She began arriving earlier in the mornings, quietly taking on additional responsibilities without being asked. Most tellingly, she stopped making casual references to future plans, as if she sensed that his horizon was becoming increasingly limited. One particularly difficult evening in late October, Jonathan experienced his worst episode yet. The chemotherapy had left him violently ill, and he had spent most of the day in his bathroom, too weak and nauseated to maintain his usual facade of normalcy. When Camilla knocked on his bedroom door to bring him dinner, he barely managed to call out that he wasn't hungry. Instead of leaving as he expected, she opened the door and stepped inside. Jonathan was lying on his bed, fully clothed, pale and sweating, looking nothing like the commanding billionaire who had hired her 6 weeks earlier. "Mr. Blake," she said softly, setting down the tray and approaching his bedside. "You're not well?" He tried to summon his usual authoritative tone, to dismiss her concerns and send her away, but he lacked the strength for pretense. "It's just a stomach bug," he managed weakly. "I'll be fine tomorrow." Camila studied his face with those penetrating brown eyes, and Jonathan knew she could see through his lie. Without asking permission, she sat on the edge of his bed and placed her cool hand against his forehead. Checking for fever with the practiced efficiency of someone who had cared for a sick relative. "How long have you been ill?" she asked gently. "Makes you think I'm ill?" he replied, though even to his own ears the denial sounded hollow. "Because I watched my grandmother die of cancer," Camila said quietly. "I recognize the signs, the weight loss, the fatigue, the way you sometimes stop mid-conversation, as if you're fighting pain. The frequent doctor appointments you think no one notices." Jonathan felt something break inside him at her words. For months, he had carried the burden of his diagnosis alone, convinced that admitting his mortality would somehow make him weak. But lying there in his darkened bedroom, too sick to maintain his walls, he found he no longer had the energy to lie. "Pancreatic cancer," he whispered. 3 months, maybe less." Camila's composure cracked for just a moment, her eyes filling. With tears, she quickly blinked away. But she didn't offer empty reassurances or false optimism. Instead, she simply took his hand in both of hers. "I'm sorry," she said, and the genuine sorrow in her voice nearly undid him completely. "That must be terrifying." "I'm not afraid of dying," Jonathan found himself admitting. "I'm afraid of dying alone." The words hung between them in the dim room, more honest than anything he had said to another human being in decades. Camila squeezed his hand gently, and for a long moment, they sat in silence. "You don't have to be alone," she said finally. Over the following days, an unspoken understanding developed between them. Camila took on more of his personal care without making him feel diminished. She researched his condition, learning about treatments and dietary recommendations. She began spending her evenings reading to him when he was too weak to focus on business documents, her voice transforming his sterile bedroom into something warmer. But as November arrived and Jonathan's condition continued to deteriorate, found himself consumed by thoughts that went beyond gratitude for her companionship. Camila had awakened something in him that he thought had died years ago. It's not just attraction, though he was certainly drawn to her beauty and grace, but a deeper longing for true intimacy. He began to watch her differently, noticing the way lamplight caught the gold highlights in her dark hair, how her face became animated when she talked about books or her memories of her grandmother. He found himself wondering what it would be like to truly know her, to share not just conversation, but genuine closeness with another human being. The idea that had been forming in his mind was both desperate and shameful. He was a dying man, old enough to be her father, offering her nothing but wealth in exchange for something that should be freely given or not at all. Yet the thought of leaving this world without ever experiencing real intimacy, without knowing what it meant to be truly close to another person, consumed him. On a rainy Thursday evening, as Camila sat reading Nerutha's love poems aloud to him, Jonathan finally found the courage to voice his impossible request. "Camila," he interrupted gently, and she looked up from the book with those warm, attentive eyes. "There's something I need to ask you." Set the book aside and gave him her full attention, as she always did. Even in his weakened state, she treated his words as if they mattered, as if he still had something valuable to offer the world. "I know this will sound terrible," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know it's unfair of me to even ask, but I can't stop thinking about the fact that I'm going to die without ever having truly known love." Camila's expression remained neutral, but he saw her hands tighten slightly in her lap. "I'm not talking about the relationships I've had," he continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "Those were transactions, arrangements between people who wanted something from each other. I'm talking about real intimacy, the kind of closeness that comes from genuine caring." He paused, knowing that his next words would either destroy the fragile bond they had built or open a door to something he had never dared hope for. "I want to ask if you would consider spending one night with me," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Not as my employee, not for money, though I would provide for your future in ways you can't imagine. But as two people who care about each other, sharing whatever time I have left." Oh, the silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Milo's face showed a mixture of emotions he couldn't read, and Jonathan immediately regretted his words. He had destroyed everything with his selfish desperation. "Mr. Blake," she began, and he braced himself for her rejection. For the disgust and disappointment he was sure he would see in her eyes. But when she looked at him, there was no judgment, only a deep sadness that seemed to encompass more than just his request. "I understand why you're asking," she said softly, "and I'm honored that you trust me enough to share something so personal. But I can't give you one night for the reasons you're describing." Jonathan nodded, feeling foolish and ashamed. Of course, she would refuse. What had he been thinking? However, Camila continued, and he looked up in surprise. "I can offer you something else, something that might be more valuable than what you're asking for." "What do you mean?" Camila stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. When she turned back to him, there was a determination in her expression that he had never seen before. "I can offer you my heart," she said simply, "not for one night, but for whatever time you have left. Real love, the kind you're searching for, doesn't come from physical intimacy alone. It comes from truly knowing someone, from being known by them, from choosing each other every day despite flaws and fears and uncertainty." Jonathan stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you want to experience love before you die, then let me love you," Camila replied. "Not as your employee, not for your money, but as a woman who sees something worth loving in the man behind all that wealth and power. But it has to be real, Jonathan. It has to be honest, and it has to be a choice we both make freely." She moved back to his bedside and sat down, taking his hand in hers. "If you agree, then for whatever time you have left, we'll be together as equals. No employer and employee, no rich man and poor woman. Just Jonathan and Camila, learning to love each other the way people were meant to be loved." Jonathan felt tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't remember starting to cry. In all his calculations about life and business, he had never considered that someone might offer him something infinitely more valuable than what he had asked for. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you do that?" Camila smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "'Cause I've been watching you these past weeks, and I've seen who you really are underneath all the armor you wear. You're kind, Jonathan. You're generous in ways you don't even recognize. You're intelligent and funny and more vulnerable than you want anyone to know. And you're dying alone not because you're unlovable, but because you've never let anyone close enough to love you." She paused, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "And maybe because I'm a little bit selfish too," she admitted. "Because I've never been in love either, and I'd rather risk my heart on something real than play it safe and wonder for the rest of my life what I might have missed." The morning after their conversation changed everything and nothing at once. Jonathan woke to find Camila sitting in the chair beside his bed, reading a book of poetry while soft classical music played from his sound system. She looked up when she heard him stirring, and their eyes met with the knowledge of what had passed between them the night before. "Good morning," she said, and those simple words carried the weight of 1,000 promises. "Good morning," he replied, and for the first time in months, he meant it. What followed were the most extraordinary weeks of Jonathan Blake's life. True to her word, Camila approached their arrangement not as an obligation, but as a genuine relationship. She moved her belongings from the guest house into the main residence, taking up residence in the suite adjacent to his master bedroom. The symbolism was important to both of them. They were choosing to be together, but without the presumption that physical intimacy would automatically follow emotional connection. Instead, they embarked on the kind of courtship that Jonathan had never experienced, even as a young man. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Camila told him about growing up in a small border town, about helping her grandmother run their modest hotel, about the dreams she had harbored, but never voiced because they seemed too big for. Someone like her, Jonathan found himself sharing memories he had buried for decades. He talked about his childhood, about the pressure he had felt to live up to his father's expectations, about the loneliness of always being the smartest person in the room, but never the most understood. He told her about business deals that had made him millions, but left him feeling empty. About the gradual realization that success without connection was just elaborate solitude. They established rituals that gave structure to their days together. Morning coffee on the terrace, where they would watch the fog lift from the bay while sharing comfortable silence. Afternoon walks through the extensive gardens, where Camila would point out birds and flowers, while Jonathan learned to see beauty in things he had previously overlooked. Evening conversations by the fireplace, where they took turns reading aloud to each other, their voices weaving together in the growing intimacy of shared stories. Camila had an uncanny ability to make Jonathan feel simultaneously cared for and respected. She never treated him like an invalid, even as his physical condition continued to decline. Instead, she adapted to his limitations naturally, suggesting indoor activities on days when he felt weak, preparing meals that were both appetizing and gentle on his compromised digestive system, creating an environment where he could be sick without feeling diminished. Most remarkably, she helped him reconnect with aspects of himself that had been dormant for years. Under her gentle encouragement, he began playing piano again, his fingers hesitant at first, but gradually remembering melodies he had loved in his youth. She convinced him to show her his private art studio, a room he hadn't entered in over a decade, where canvases and paints waited like forgotten friends. "I used to paint," he told her as they stood in the dusty space, afternoon light streaming through tall windows. "What changed?" she asked, running her fingers along the edge of an easel. "I got busy, building the company, making deals, staying ahead of the competition. Art seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford, and now..." Jonathan considered the question. "Seriously?" Now I realized that art wasn't the luxury. Time was, and I wasted most of mine. That afternoon, Camila helped him set up his easel again. She sat for him as he attempted to capture her portrait, his hands shaking not just from illness, but from the emotion of rediscovering a part of himself he had thought was lost forever. The painting was far from perfect, but as he worked, he felt more alive than he had in years. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by others. Rosa, who had worked for Jonathan for 15 years, watched their relationship develop with a mixture of approval and concern. She had seen her employer at his most isolated and driven, and while she was happy to see him finally connecting with another person, she worried about what would happen to Camila when the inevitable occurred. "Are you sure about this, Mia?" Rosa asked Camila one afternoon while they worked together in the kitchen. "I've seen how much you care for him, but this path you're on, it only leads to heartbreak." Camila paused in her task of arranging flowers, considering her response carefully. "Yes, it will lead to heartbreak," she agreed. "But it's also leading to something beautiful, for both of us. Isn't love worth the risk of pain?" Rosa studied her niece's face, seeing a happiness there that she had never witnessed before. Despite the underlying sadness of their situation, "Just promise me you won't lose yourself in taking care of him." "I'm not losing myself," Camila replied softly. "I'm finding myself. For the first time in my life, I'm with someone who sees me as I really am and loves me for it." Their relationship faced its first major test when Rebecca Blake arrived unexpectedly one December afternoon. Jonathan's sister was a formidable woman, in her mid-50s, a successful attorney who had built her own empire in corporate law. She had heard rumors about her brother's condition and his mysterious live-in companion, and she had come to investigate. "Jonathan," she said, striding into his study without knocking, her steel-gray eyes taking in his obviously deteriorated condition. With shock, she tried to hide. "You look terrible. How long have you been sick?" "Hello, Rebecca. It's nice to see." "You too," Jonathan replied dryly, not looking up from the financial documents he had been reviewing. "About 6 months, if you must know." 6 months? Rebecca's voice rose an octave. "And you didn't think to tell your only sister that you were dying?" "I'm not dying," Jonathan said, though they both knew it was a lie. "I'm just dealing with some health issues. Don't insult my intelligence." You have cancer, don't you? Pancreatic, if I had to guess, based on how you look. Rebecca's legal training had taught her to read people and situations quickly, and she could see the truth written in her brother's gaunt face and weakened posture. Before Jonathan could respond, Camila appeared in the doorway with a tea service, moving with the quiet grace that had become familiar to him over the past months. "Brought some tea," she said, setting the tray on a side table. "I thought you might need some refreshment." Rebecca's sharp eyes immediately shifted to Camila, taking in her youth, her beauty, and the comfortable familiarity with which she moved through Jonathan's private space. "And you are." Rebecca's voice carried the prosecutorial tone she used. "In courtrooms, Camila Rodriguez," she replied, extending her hand with quiet dignity. "I work for your brother." "Work for him." Rebecca repeated the words with obvious skepticism. In what capacity exactly? The tension in the room was palpable. Jonathan started to speak, but Camila stepped forward, meeting Rebecca's challenging gaze directly. "I take care of him," she said simply. "I make sure he eats, help manage his medications, provide companionship when he needs it. I care about." "What happens to him? How convenient," Rebecca said coldly. "I suppose you have no interest whatsoever in his money." "Rebecca, that's enough," Jonathan interjected. But Camila raised her hand gently, indicating she could handle the confrontation herself. "You're right to be suspicious," Camila said, surprising both siblings. "If I were in your position, I would ask the same questions. Your brother is a very wealthy man, and I'm a woman with no family and very few resources from the outside. This probably looks like a classic case of someone taking advantage of a sick, lonely old man." Rebecca nodded approvingly, clearly expecting Camila to crumble under direct questioning. "But here's what you don't see," Camila continued. "I've never asked your brother for anything beyond fair wages for honest work. I've never inquired about his will, his investments, or his business dealings. I don't care if he leaves everything to charity or sets his money on fire. What I care about is that he doesn't spend his remaining time alone and afraid." She moved to stand beside Jonathan's chair, placing her hand gently on his shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "I love him," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Not for what he can give me, but for who he is. Yes, I know he's dying. I know that loving him means I'm going to lose him. I'd rather have a few months of real love than a lifetime of wondering what it might have felt like." The room fell silent. Rebecca stared at Camila as if seeing her for the first time, while Jonathan felt his heart racing with emotions he couldn't name. "You love him," Rebecca repeated slowly. "Yes. And you, Jonathan, do you love her?" Jonathan looked up at Camila, who was watching him with those warm brown eyes that had become his anchor in the storm of his illness. "More than I've ever loved anyone," he said quietly. "More than I knew it was possible to love." Rebecca walked to the window, looking out at the gardens while she processed this information. When she turned back, her expression had softened considerably. She said finally, "This is unexpected. I came here prepared to confront a gold digger who was taking advantage of my dying brother. Instead, I find two people who appear to be genuinely in love." She approached Camila again, studying her with new interest. "You said you've never asked him for anything. What happens to you when he's gone? Have you thought about that?" "I'll grieve," Camila answered honestly. "And then I'll figure out how to build a life that honors what we had together. That's not very practical." "Love isn't practical," Camila replied. "If it were, I would have protected my heart better." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I made assumptions based on appearances and stereotypes. It was unfair." "You're protecting your brother," Camila replied graciously. "I respect that." That evening, the three of them had dinner together, and Jonathan watched in amazement as Camila gradually won over his notoriously difficult sister. By the time Rebecca left the next morning, she had become an unexpected ally. "Take care of him," she told Camila as they said goodbye, "and let him take care of you too. He needs to feel useful, needed. Don't rob him of that by being too independent." "Won't," Camila promised. "And Jonathan," Rebecca said, hugging her brother goodbye, "I'm glad you found her. You deserve to know what love feels like." After Rebecca's departure, Jonathan and Camila settled into an even deeper rhythm of companionship. The external validation of their relationship, even from his skeptical sister, seemed to remove the last barriers between them. They began sharing, not just days but nights, lying together in his large bed, talking until they fell asleep in each other's arms. Their physical intimacy developed gradually, naturally, without the desperate urgency that had characterized Jonathan's original request. Instead of one night of passion, they discovered the deeper pleasure of growing closer day by day, touch by touch, trust by trust. One snowy evening in late December, as they sat by the fireplace watching flames dance in the grate, Camilla asked, the question that had been unspoken between them for weeks, "Are you happy, Jonathan?" He considered the question seriously, as he had learned to do with all of her inquiries. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Despite everything, despite knowing what's coming, I'm happier than I've ever been." "Though you're sick, especially because I'm sick," he replied. "If I weren't dying, I might never have let myself be vulnerable enough to love you the way I do. I might have kept all my walls up forever." Camilla curled closer to him on the sofa, her head resting against his shoulder. "Do you think we would have found each other anyway? It's in a different life, different circumstances?" Jonathan smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'd like to think we would have. But maybe we needed these exact circumstances to become the people who could recognize what we had." "I used to be angry about my parents dying," Camilla admitted, "about growing up poor, about having to take care of my grandmother instead of going to college like other girls my age. Those things had happened. I wouldn't have been working as a housekeeper. I wouldn't have been here when you needed someone." "Do you believe in fate?" Jonathan asked. "I believe in love," she replied. "And I believe that when two people are meant to be together, the universe finds a way to make it happen, even if the path is painful." They made love that night for the first time, not with the desperate passion of people trying to cheat death, but with the tender reverence of two souls who had found their home in each other. It was everything Jonathan had dreamed intimacy could be, and nothing like he had expected, slow and sweet and profound. Less about physical pleasure than about the complete joining of two lives that had chosen to become one. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness, listening to each other's breathing and the quiet settling sounds of the old house around them, Jonathan felt a peace he had never known was possible. "Camilla," he whispered. "Yes, thank you for loving me." "Thank you for letting me," she replied. Outside, snow continued to fall on the gardens and vineyards, covering everything in pristine white.